Hello, I am Sungchul Choi. In this session, before we dive into learning about machine learning, we are going to take some time to study various terms related to machine learning. In fact, if you are someone studying machine learning for the first time, you will encounter a lot of so-called buzzwords. You might have learned various terms, and the main goal of this session is to organize those terms comprehensively. Yes, the first concept is machine learning. You've probably heard about it a lot already. You've heard about it a lot, and we've been talking about machine learning continuously. I assume you already know about it. Next is big data. It seems like it's often used to mean that the data is large, but you might be a bit confused about how large the data is supposed to be, and what the purpose of having such large data is. Another term is data science. It's another commonly used expression. These days, people often say, I'm doing data science. But you might be confused about how it differs from machine learning or big data. For those who studied in the past, there's also the term data mining. When you say mining, it generally refers to extracting resources from a mine. Mining refers to extraction, and those who studied a long time ago have probably heard the term data mining quite often. And then you might be curious about the differences between data mining and machine learning. I would like to clarify those things for you today. First, let's look at big data. Big data refers to data that is very large in size within a given time frame. It's data and it's very large in size. It's large in size. We say that this data is so large that it is difficult to process with a single machine within a given time frame. What this means is, in fact, if you're a university student, especially in computer science, you might have had a database class. Usually it's a subject for juniors or seniors, or industrial engineering students might have had a database class too. And the data you typically use there is, well, if it's large, about 100 megabytes. Of course, it might vary slightly depending on the university. If it's 100 megabytes or larger, maybe it could be around 10 gigabytes. I don't think you'd even use data of this size yet, usually during lab sessions. But is this amount of data really considered big data? If you think about it, actually, all this data can be queried using select statements, ED, and although it takes a bit of time, it can be processed. What does processing mean? When data is requested and it is displayed on our screen like this, and it appears on the screen like this, then it has been processed. It's a bit difficult to call this kind of data big data. It's hard to say that the data is very large, but if this data is about 1 terabyte, or even if it's not up to 1 terabyte, trying to call up about 500 gigabytes at once would take quite a long time. If the data exceeds 1 terabyte and reaches about 10 terabytes, it can be difficult to process with a single computer or when making requests using very complex queries. Of course, with good tuning, it might be possible to process it, but data that is so large that it cannot be handled by a single computer is typically referred to as big data. But why exactly do we call this big data? Well, this is because the concept of big data includes not only the size of the data, but also the concept of distributed processing. Since the data is too large to be processed by a single computer or machine, it is divided and processed across multiple computers. Typically about 10 or 20 computers execute queries simultaneously by dividing the tasks among them. These are what can be referred to as big data. So, you can think of what is called big data as a concept of big data processing technology. We often confuse the concepts of big data and machine learning, but technically speaking, big data refers to data so large that it requires distributed processing across multiple computers to be manageable. The technology used to process such data is called big data technology. Of course, so there might be different perspectives and slightly different expressions used, but generally, when I refer to big data, I want to emphasize that the data size is so large that it is difficult to process with a single machine. Then, as we've discussed before, machine learning is about the computer learning patterns from data. It's a technique for learning. And I believe this term carries two meanings. One is the algorithm, the other is the model. I'll explain more about what this is later, but it's a higher level concept that includes both the algorithm and the model. So there's the concept of machine learning, and under this concept, there are various algorithms and models. I will explain more about these algorithms and models in the next session. Therefore, it's a method by which a computer learns, composed of these algorithms and models. However, in machine learning, the size of the data is not actually important. So the larger the size of the data, the greater the possibility of achieving better performance. However, having a small amount of data model does not make machine learning as itself impossible. Generally, we often use examples like monist for learning handwriting and such, but in any case, in machine learning, the focus is more on how the computer learns from the data rather than the size of the data. Big data refers to technology where the data size is so large that it is processed in a distributed manner across more than one computer. Machine learning can be understood as a collection of techniques, or a higher level concept of techniques for learning patterns from data. Now, the next term you often hear is data mining. Actually, when I was younger, to be precise, when I was an undergraduate or a graduate student, and since I studied business administration as an undergraduate and industrial engineering in graduate school, I am quite familiar with the term data mining. In fact, it is often used interchangeably with machine learning. So, it is commonly described as finding patterns from large data sets, discovering meaningful patterns, and making decisions based on them. In fact, the main difference with machine learning, although opinions may vary, is that data mining ultimately supports decision making by connecting to the business field. I believe that enabling decision making is the purpose of data mining. So, if machine learning is a collection of algorithms or models, we will learn more about what a model is later. If it's a collection of models, then data mining is an application made using that. Therefore, things like spam filters or product recommendations are examples of data mining. However, in fact, these are also examples of machine learning. So, you might wonder if it's really meaningful to distinguish between them. But if we organize it a bit more, well, usually what is discussed in data mining is about collecting data like this. By gathering that data, we extract the specific data we need, and after extracting that data, we pre-process it, such as removing unnecessary data or adding necessary data to process it. Then we transform it into a form that we can analyze. Then, although we say we are doing data mining, in fact, when performing data mining, we end up using various machine learning algorithms. So deriving the necessary knowledge, decision making, or any required outcomes from there is considered a part of the data mining process. And in fact, all of this is sometimes referred to as a single data mining process. Therefore, within the data mining process, the area where we find patterns can be called machine learning. We can refer to this entire process as the data mining process, but there are people who think this way and others who do not. Now, if you look again, the part you need to remember, I believe, is this part. Earlier, we used the term big data technology, and I used the term machine learning. Big data is actually a technology that helps process enormously large amounts of data in the context of, because the data is too large for a computer, if you understand concepts like memory, it will be easier to grasp. If we need to process data that is much larger than the amount of memory a single computer can handle, it becomes difficult to process with just one computer. Therefore, it needs to be processed by dividing it across multiple computers. The technology of processing by dividing across multiple computers is what we call big data technology, and this is generally referred to as data engineering. It is often discussed by distinguishing it as engineering. Then from another perspective, finding patterns in data, meaningful patterns, there is a field of work that involves finding patterns, and we use the term data analysis. We can broadly discuss these concepts by dividing them into two branches: big data processing technology and machine learning. I think this is very important. Generally, we might think that big data, like machine learning, is about finding meaningful patterns, uncovering something hidden, and creating artificial intelligence. However, in the industry, big data technology typically refers to the technology for processing large volumes of data. It's more about the technology for extracting data rather than analyzing it. I believe it's correct. How do you view it? as a technology for extracting data. So please distinguish between these two concepts, and in the future, when I talk about big data technology, I will often use the term big data processing technology. Therefore, when I mention big data processing technology, you should think of it as extracting data. Usually, when we talk about machine learning or data analysis, it means finding patterns. It would be good to understand it as finding patterns from data. Now, if we summarize the concepts we learned earlier, in fact, it's not always exactly like this. First of all, I see big data as a kind of application, considering where big data or data mining will be utilized. Big data is a concept of processing big data in some way. Then, to process this big data, we need technical concepts, and in data mining, that's precisely where machine learning comes in. So, data mining is done using machine learning and big data. Processing is done using distributed processing or traditional database technologies. And to implement this, various algorithms or implementations are needed, such as Hadoop, Spark, Bigtable, NoSQL, or in machine learning, libraries like Weka, support vector machines, logistic regression, and many more. I think there are a lot of these things out there. But in fact, since big data can encompass all of this, there might be arguments about whether it's right or wrong to separate them like this. But for now, these two should be distinguished. I think data engineering and data analysis should be distinguished. Next, big data technology is actually the sum of distributed processing technology and database management technology, so please mention that. In fact, in our lecture, we will cover this part a little at the very end. We won't go into detail either. Later, we will just upload it to the cloud and try to bring in really massive data from the cloud and then pass it to machine learning, so this part is not our core area of study. However, Power, if you know it, eventually we will now have a pipeline. We call the process of bringing in massive data, running it through machine learning, and creating meaningful applications or apps from it a pipeline. Yes, we call it a pipeline, and I believe that to grow as a machine learning engineer, you need to have some understanding of the technologies within this pipeline. Another thing you need to know, and one of the buzzwords that comes up frequently, is actually the term deep learning. In fact, you've probably heard the term deep learning so often that you might not know it well, or you might be very familiar with it. Deep learning is actually a machine learning algorithm, specifically an algorithm known as a neural net within machine learning. You can consider it as a technology that uses this neural net. It's a machine learning algorithm that uses neural nets, or should I say a neural net-based machine learning algorithm, or should I call it a model? Yes, I think the term algorithm would be appropriate. However, recently, because it has been producing very good results, it has become quite a trend in the machine learning field, especially in image processing, images, or NLP, natural language processing. It boasts outstanding performance. Some people also distinguish between machine learning and talk about machine learning versus deep learning, right? Well, DL is deep learning. ML is machine learning. People talk about this, but I somewhat disagree. Machine learning is a much broader concept, and deep learning is a concept within it. Of course, considering growth and such, there was a time when deep learning was somewhat neglected, so some people might say this, but I don't think that's quite right. Deep learning has grown so large within the broader field of machine learning that it's almost its own field. In fact, there were people who used to say that machine learning was a subfield of statistics. Looking at it that way, deep learning has grown so large that it has become one of the major fields within machine learning. Well, actually it's deep learning that has become so big. We do not engage in deep learning. For reference, we don't cover deep learning extensively in this lecture. We only cover a very early model called the multi-layer perceptron. We don't cover it extensively, but the reason deep learning has become so significant is actually due to something called the ImageNet challenge, where some people in the machine learning field focus on images. There is a competition where people who work with images collaborate to provide various photos and have the computer identify what is in the photo. This competition is called ImageNet, and it involves technology that identifies about 1,000 different object classes one by one. So ImageNet became quite popular. And in this ImageNet, machine learning or rather deep learning, my apologies. Deep learning achieved significant results. From 2011 to 2012, a significant figure in machine learning, Professor Yann LeCun, one of his students, known as AlexNet, can I write this in red? Yes, one of Professor Yann LeCun's students, I believe his name is Alex. If you consider Alex, he developed a technology for processing images using deep learning. This showed nearly a 10% improvement in performance compared to previous methods. People started to realize, wow, this is incredible. And so every year, more people began to get involved. The following year, there was a 5% improvement and another 5% the year after that, leading up to 2016 with the development of the residual net or Google Net, which was created by Google. It's sometimes called Google Net, though. But the residual net, also known as ResNet, eventually achieved results, surpassing the human error rate of 5%. With the image recognition rate becoming lower than that of humans, deep learning began to emerge as a dominant trend. This marked a decisive period of advancement for deep learning starting from 2012. Well, as I mentioned earlier, since the first computers emerged in the 1950s, we have had dreams about AI. AI is a broad concept, and even very basic AI, or like if-then statements, are indeed AI. If a certain condition is met, which is also known as rule-based, then do A. If a certain condition is met, then do B. These can also be considered a type of AI, and since the 1950s, or as the idea of developing artificial intelligence emerged, it has continuously evolved. In the 1980s, machine learning began to show various possibilities. Although it was machine learning at that time, deep learning also started with the concept of neural networks. Though the technology known as backpropagation was developed around 1983 or 1984 by Professor Yann LeCun, though it might not have been the very first instance. He probably proposed it. So, although the technology of deep learning was discovered at that time, it didn't progress much until the mid-1990s, when a technology called CNN emerged, which led to the development of techniques that could almost perfectly recognize handwritten characters. So it became a huge hit, then suddenly declined, but then, as mentioned earlier, with the creation of AlexNet in ImageNet, it became a mega hit, marking the era of deep learning, where machine learning transitioned into deep learning. The era arrived where deep learning became the representative of machine learning. But actually, when it comes to the early days of deep learning, I believe it dates back to the 1960s. I recall that the feed-forward neural network emerged sometime in the 1960s. Therefore, while this may not be entirely accurate, if the mainstream of technology used to be about doing machine learning, and now it has shifted significantly towards doing deep learning, and that's all you need to know. Since we won't be dealing with deep learning, it's enough to know that the concept of deep learning is a subset of machine learning, but it performs exceptionally well. Especially in areas like image processing or translation, it is said to perform very well, and it might be good to be aware of that. In fact, earlier we talked about big data, and here we have big data. If you look up keywords like big data, machine learning, deep learning, and Hadoop, which maintains big data within big data, you'll find that experts do talk about these distributed processing technologies when discussing big data, but are they experts? I'm not sure what exactly defines an expert, but engineers do talk about it. In fact, finding patterns in machine learning is also considered part of big data, and big data is often used as if it's on par with AI. So many people will search like this. As you can see, starting from 2017, we have entered an era where machine learning has surpassed big data. So the times are continuously changing, but people do know that big data means having a sufficient amount of data. From there, they try to find meaningful patterns, and the best way to find these patterns is through deep learning. So nowadays, people often talk about the era of deep learning, but we will focus only on machine learning, not deep learning. Deep learning is often referred to as magic, or commonly as a silver bullet. It's called a silver bullet, but deep learning is not a magic bullet. It's not a magic bullet, and not a technology that can solve everything. You will know later when you try it, but it is an algorithm that exists in general machine learning rather than deep learning. Although this distinction is made, using algorithms from machine learning can sometimes yield better results than those from deep learning. And there is still a competition site called Kaggle, where machine learning engineers or data scientists participate. And in these competitions, a wide variety of machine learning algorithms are still used, more than deep learning. So I want to emphasize that deep learning is not necessarily the only answer. Of course, deep learning will continue to develop in the future. So whether it's machine learning or deep learning, our initial goal is to find meaningful patterns from data. For those who want to find these patterns, I recommend starting with machine learning step by step, rather than jumping straight into deep learning. Let me talk about the big picture. Earlier, we divided it into two main categories. One is data engineering technology for processing large volumes of data. The other is data analytics technology for analyzing meaningful patterns in data. The main core there is actually machine learning, or in computer science. It was historically referred to as pattern recognition, and recognition was used almost interchangeably. So machine learning, distributed processing, and databases are the core technologies. Based on this, big data processing became possible, and similarly data mining through machine learning or pattern recognition. These are technologies that have been widely used in the business domain. Then computer vision, which enables capabilities similar to human vision, or natural language processing that mimics human language. Ultimately, these things combined can be seen as artificial intelligence. Then there are various algorithms that make machine learning possible. Various algorithms that make up machine learning, neural networks, for instance, are the beginnings of deep learning. Then there are support vector models, decision trees, and so on. These are supported by mathematical foundations such as probability, statistics, or linear algebra, which is algebra. There's also linear algebra or information theory. These come together to form a big picture. Similarly, technologies like Hadoop, Spark, and NoSQL are needed for distributed or parallel processing. These have evolved from MapReduce or distributed file storage methods like HDFS or GFS, known as the Google File System, enabling today's big data, like machine learning or data mining. And I want to say that we can call this whole thing data science, but there are people who don't think this way. Since everyone thinks differently, some people consider data science as a term, contrasting with artificial intelligence. As an expression contrasting with artificial intelligence, I consider artificial intelligence to be, in a somewhat narrow sense, in making computers act like humans. Some people think that is what artificial intelligence is. Even if we don't necessarily make computers act like humans, we can still call the decision-making process done by computers artificial intelligence. This is my opinion. So some people limit data science to decision-making related to business problems. There are also people who, when talking about data science, include aspects like probability and statistics, as well as big data processing. So people's concepts of data science, artificial intelligence, and data mining vary slightly. I don't think there's a right answer. This is my opinion. It's literally just my opinion. And is big data important? In fact, when there wasn't big data, we couldn't achieve the level of performance we have now. There is an enormous amount of data. A lot of large-scale data has emerged, and it gets fed into machine learning. And as it goes into machine learning and various other things, it has enabled analyses that were not possible before. Therefore, while big data is very important, it's not necessary to learn big data to be able to do these things. Conversely, it's not that you must learn this to be able to do it. As I mentioned earlier, these are things that happen within the pipeline of analyzing data, so I just want to say that studying these together can be very helpful. As I said before, this is my opinion. It's not the correct answer. In my opinion, the important thing is to think about it separately. Data engineering and data analysis and the whole of this is data science. To briefly add a side note, I think that in today's world, everything is data science. I believe that everything done with data is data science. In fact, in social sciences, business studies, and similar fields, they have been using statistical concepts for a long time to support their arguments. So they have proven their logic and claims. with evidence. They would say, we experimented with statistics and this is what we found. But in the future, I believe that concepts like machine learning and data mining, which are part of data science, will also be extensively used in fields like social sciences. Therefore, I personally believe that data science, like statistics in the past, will become a tool used across all fields of study. That was quite a lengthy digression. Well, this is something someone else said. This is from something called KD Nuggets. KD Nuggets. I memorized it thoroughly, and it's something defined by KD Nuggets. There, they say that machine learning ultimately enables data mining. They view data mining as an application, just like I see it as an application. There, if you extract only the deep neural networks, it makes deep learning possible. That's how they put it. And as I mentioned earlier, data mining doesn't just involve algorithms, it encompasses everything from the data pre-processing stage. Therefore, big data must necessarily be included in data mining. Machine learning is also connected to artificial intelligence. I brought this up to show that everyone has their own perspective on this. There is no correct answer. There is no correct answer, but it's necessary to think about it with some distinction, and I don't think there's a need to argue about who is right. 1, 2. Okay, up to here. It's related to very simple data, whether it's data science or data mining, anything is fine. Anyway, I have explained various concepts related to data. If you continue to study these concepts, especially knowing these will make you seem knowledgeable. So distinguish them a bit, especially because I find it a bit unappealing. I know how to handle big data. This expression seems to be quite vague. Saying you know how to handle big data is ambiguous to me. Does it mean you can use Hadoop or Google BigQuery to retrieve large data sets, that you can analyze them well, or that you are good at using statistics? I think it would be better if we could distinguish and articulate these things more clearly. Now you're studying, right? So next time I will explain in detail how to study machine learning and what exactly you will learn in machine learning. Thank you.